Number 9. Come on in. We got a great presentation. Want to learn about blockchain? One thing about that I've learned about blockchain over the last few years is that the people who are leading blockchain, crypto, and everything associated with it are not shy, and they're not reserved in expressing their opinions. They think big, and that's what's really the cool thing about it. The irony being that a lot of people can succeed, I think, with various, maybe not various blockchain technologies, but with some, on projects that are rather small. And of course, with an enterprise IT, the instinct is always, or almost always, to think MVP, POC, let's start small. And our next speaker, I've even heard him advise people to do that. We had the honor and privilege to have him speak at Cloud Expo a couple of years ago, very recently, here in New York, and he's back. And today, as you can see by the title of his presentation, to re-architect Earth's operating system, he's thinking big again. And I think that's wonderful, so I'll let him talk. Andrew Keys with Consensus, come on up.
Test.
There you go, you're good, my
Thanks,
friend.
Roger.
All right.
So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Satoshi Nakamoto. Yeah, we're all Satoshi. So in thinking about what to speak about today, I started kind of pondering what we as society face as probably our biggest problem. And for a minute, I just submit for your consideration, maybe it's that people don't feel like they're actual stakeholders. Most people don't own anything. Literally, they're renting day to day, week to week, month to month, leeching on the weak, looting from the state, and also part of a top-down hierarchical command and control ecosystem. And I'd posit for a second that perhaps we could change that, where potentially everyone could have the chance to own a little bit of everything. Imagine a world of equity, tokenized organizations where everyone owns a stake in everyone else's project and is tangibly incentivized to root for everyone else's success. So basically, we could enable a world of stakeholders. With nothing but stakeholders, we would create much more, and we'd probably have little destruction. And I believe that could lead society to exponential growth. This gentleman, Ronald Coase, is a Nobel laureate, and he was famous for essentially creating the concept of the firm, or at least documenting and hypothesizing the fact that where, as a company grows, the cost of a marginal transaction must be less than that of getting the task done in an open market. And we've seen an era of growing balance sheets, growing large enterprise incumbents, and potentially, now that communication and decision-making has become faster and cheaper, it may make sense to essentially outsource everything in the open market except a core competency. And if we do this, we could essentially turn this around and have a shrinking optimal size for a corporation down to the individual, essentially self-sovereign. So, especially for the majority of Earth that lives not even less than $100,000 a year, the majority of Earth, we've got people that are living on $2 a day. Would you rather have our minimum wage employment, or perhaps kind of a gamified way where participants are self-sovereign and able to participate in an economy in a true sole peer-to-peer environment? So I believe we're getting there. So 2018 in the blockchain years, in my opinion, is the equivalent of 1994 when dial-up started in 1996. We're about 2 years away from something of real scale to start. And very simply put, I believe that we're in that time zone because of a few reasons. So first, blockchains aren't really scaling yet. Transactional throughput is very low, and there are roadmaps to improve this. Second, we're not in a place of standards. For you technology historians, when Java became J2EE, Java 2 Enterprise Edition, and became the most popular software language in the world, it's because they had clean database APIs and clean web APIs. We're starting to see standards formulate. And I think once we have that type of information, we're going to start to see a massive growth in this space. So, the internet that we know has been great, but I'd argue the internet that we know is essentially an oligopoly of a handful of intermediaries. We log into Facebook. We log into our online banking. We log into Twitter, eBay, Uber, Airbnb, PayPal, etc. And they're essentially providing a few common denominators. Trust, a payment rail in most cases, reputation, kind of the 5 stars at the end of the Uber. And I believe that we are going to start seeing the re-architecture of our social, financial, political operating systems in a peer-to-peer, self-sovereign manner. And when we see this, we will create a price discovery mechanism for the value of intermediation in any transaction. Intermediaries may add value, the middleman in any transaction, but in most cases, especially today, with the oligopolies that we are working with in big tech, they are, in my opinion, extracting way more value from a transaction than the value that they're providing for that thin layer of trust, intermediation, and a payment rail and reputation. So when I think of disintermediation, I think that this could enable and create new value from the intermediary to the counterparties of the transaction. So the value should flow to the content creators, the resource providers, the service providers. So a few quick examples of this. So one is a project named Ujo. Ujo is Japanese for the word container. And when we think about logging into iTunes today to purchase music, let's say for the new Beyonce album is $20, when Beyonce gets paid, it's somewhere between 3 to 6 months later, and she gets somewhere between 55 to 65% of the revenue. And that remainder is paid through intermediaries. And the iTunes, the producer, the record label, the distribution team. And what Ujo does is it essentially creates a peer-to-peer market where if you're a rock band, you can have an album essentially on your own website, and someone can purchase that album peer-to-peer. And 99.9% of the album would go to you automatically. What's more interesting is that you can create essentially smart contract automated agreements where if you have 4 people in the band, every time the album's purchased, you would have exactly the amount of splits. So if it's 25, 25, 25, 25, that could be paid out automatically. What I think is even more interesting is that if the band decided that they wanted to crowdsource the album and you were a fan, you could potentially invest and be a producer, and maybe they would decide to add the producer or the fan as a member of the revenue share. So now it could be, instead of 4 people, it could be 5, and it's the people that crowdsourced it could be 1/5, and it'd be 20/20, 20/20. And essentially we start blurring the lines between being in the band or being a fan or being an investor. And you can do this with these automated types of smart contracts. So we're also starting to see labor evolve in the form of what we call bounties. So we're starting to see, in a true peer-to-peer fashion, we can actually incentivize open source software. We've created this with something called Gitcoin. And basically, open source individuals can be paid via bounty. And other examples of essentially direct-to-consumer applications that we're starting to see is data storage. So for those of you who are familiar with the Interplanetary File System, or IPFS, heavy compute, we're actually seeing the democratization of a kilowatt hour, where if Alice has a solar panel on her roof, she can digitize the electricity and sell a digital version of the electron peer-to-peer to Bob. So the internet that has been evolving started with images, text, and hyperlinks in Web 1.0. And with 2.0, we're going to have interactive commerce. And with Web 3.0, that's coming. It will be, in my opinion, the internet of automated agreements. So the internet that we know now commoditized how humans communicate, and the internet en route is going to commoditize how we as humans agree. So we as humans are, in my opinion, on the flat part of the curve, and it will seem very slow, but I believe in about 2-3 years we're going to see a very fast change, similar to what we saw in 96 through 99. Humans are linear, technology is exponential, and a few of the pieces that I think that are fundamental to this change are the evolution of our agreements. So rather than a Microsoft Word document created by an attorney, we're going to see our agreements turn to software code. They will have if, then, else software clauses, and they will encumber digital assets. We're starting to see the tokenization of all assets, oil, electrons, stocks, bonds, derivatives, fiat currency, a Beyonce concert ticket, an American Express point, and we're going to be able to move these assets in real time through these automated agreements. And you're going to start seeing new types of agreements, like a employment agreement by the minute, a food stamp that you can't purchase certain types of food or maybe alcohol with. This is going to create a tremendous thawing of liquidity in what I believe were previously illiquid assets. So bear with me for 1 second. I want to make sure that I can show you this because I think it's very important. Can you see that? Pardon my French, but what I believe we are is in the bullshit sharing economy. And really, Uber is an intermediary, Lyft is an intermediary, Airbnb is an intermediary, and TaskRabbit is an intermediary extracting way more value than they're providing. And I believe that the actual sharing economy will be an n-sided marketplace, infinitely sided, meaning that we will have peer-to-peer, but we're going to have essentially the ability to have a smart contract, which is an automated piece of open source software, as the center rather than an intermediary, and we can attach various economies to that. So you could imagine a peer-to-peer Uber-like application with an automated insurance policy that could do a peer-to-peer insurance policy on that small micro policy of a ride. And the core part of that will be self-sovereign digital identity. So bear with me for 1 second. So self-sovereign digital identity is the notion of, instead of logging into all of those intermediaries in the oligopoly, we log into our own browser. We'll have our own biometric, and this will be a place where we house our reputation in forms of attributes and attestations. So an attribute about me is a fact. Maybe it's my blood type, like an electronic medical record. An attestation's reputation, something like the 5 stars at the end of the Uber. We can also have a wallet where we'll be holding these digital assets, and this will be the new browser. Instead of logging into Google Chrome or Firefox, you're going to log into the John Doe browser. And we've already started doing this in various countries. So Zug, which is a canton in Switzerland, has begun a process whereby all of the citizens are able to use this persistent, portable, self-sovereign digital identity to pay for various public services, like paying their taxes, and they can also vote. So we spoke about, just very briefly, about the decentralization of energy. And I think that this is going to be another fundamental infrastructure. So right now, energy distribution is very centralized, and when energy is moved, we lose about 35% of it going from a central producer of energy out to the various users. And we've created something called Grid Plus, whereby we can tokenize and digitize the asset of a kilowatt hour and move these assets in real time, and it's being debuted in Texas. Bear with me. So when that happens, what we're going to start seeing is the foundational elements of society move from analog to digital. So we're starting to see money, securities, title, government certification becoming digitized. We're starting to see essentially real estate becoming digitized. And with that, we can essentially remove friction. If the 200 of us in this room could co-own an asset, we could also add arbitrarily complex business logic to that asset, meaning that if after every month when the mortgage is paid, the remainder could be automatically paid to the 200 of us. And if one of us wants to sell our ownership, or the digital token that represents our ownership, we'd be able to have that move frictionlessly without having to re-architect how the limited partnership would work. So I'm from a firm named Consensus. We are about 4 years old. There were 3 of us about 4 years ago, and we just crossed, I think, 1,100, 1,200 people. And we are the largest software engineering shop in the world that's focused on building these types of technologies. There's really 4 pillars of business that we operate under, to really distill it simply: product, enterprise and government consulting, education, and capital markets. So in terms of product, we are a full stack software engineering company. we maintain at the protocol layer of the stack 3 of the 8 implementations of the Ethereum protocol. Above that, we build developer tools. So the most used smart contract developer tool in the world is called Truffle, and we built that in-house, and we've open sourced it and gifted it to the world. A lot of the early wallets and load balancing tools we've built at the developer tool level. Above that, we create standards. Standards for identity, reputation, token issuance and management, token design, fungible, non-fungible digital tokens. And then above that, we have applications. And we run the application side of the house in what we call a venture studio model. An idea becomes a project becomes a product, and that product could spin out to be its own company, where we as Consensus would own a small piece of equity in that company, and the founders would also own equity in that company. Our enterprise and government consulting team clientele includes JP Morgan, Microsoft, British Petroleum, Procter & Gamble, the Emirate of Dubai, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, large governments and businesses that are wrapping their heads around what this technology does. So we're also the consultant to the European Union. So every month they've got all of the countries come to our laboratory in Brussels, and we elucidate what a proof of concept is and scale that from proof of concept into production. Our education arm is called Consensus Academy, where we have not only training for engineers, but we also meet subject matter experts in their area of expertise. So for example, we have blockchain for lawyers, blockchain for MBAs, blockchain for healthcare. So we're creating different types of modular curriculum. And then lastly, we have capital markets, where we're essentially recognizing that banks, in many cases, are being paid to be a trusted intermediary, and this technology commoditizes trust and intermediation. And so what does financial services look like in the future, where we don't necessarily need to pay for that trust and intermediation? So what does primary issuance, what does exchange look like, where now we have these digital tokens and we actually have an atomic swap where the trade is the settlement. We don't necessarily need that DTCC in the middle to process the trade or the settlement. So that's kind of what we are, broadly speaking, from kind of an architectural side of actually building out products and infrastructure, but we are actually also somewhat of an organism. We are not top-down command and control. We've actually built this relatively bottom-up and non-hierarchical. And one of our teams have created what we call the Traditional Management Nullification Tool, or TMNT. And because we're not a hierarchical organization, we're essentially circles within circles. So basically, this is an example of one aspect of our lines of business, the venture studio that makes those different types of applications. And these are different roles within the application, and we can drill down into each of the people that are filling those roles. And we can figure out the types of activities that they're doing. And because we're a completely decentralized organization with a few hubs around the world for people to kind of go to a brick and mortar, but people can be 100% remote if they choose. So it's very early days in what I believe is the next generation of the internet. And I believe this next generation of the internet is going to re-architect how our financial, social, and political operating systems work. I think what this could do is thaw liquidity through the digitization or the tokenization of assets, unlike anything that we've ever seen in humanity. And through that, we're trying to essentially turn Ronald Coase, that Nobel laureate's concept, upside down. And basically say that maybe the nature of the firm, the optimal nature of the firm, is the human. And basically it starts from our self-sovereignty and our ability to do anything peer-to-peer. And I'd argue that the essence of decentralization is really when we, as an individual, are empowered to make decisions that best empower us. Thank you very much.
We have to get away from the speakers. I think we'll have some questions.
Hi, my name is Ben Irwin. Thanks for your presentation. I'm particularly up on the work that Consensus is doing in blockchain and Ethereum and the scalability of it. And in all my research, what my realization is a blockchain network is only as good as its nodes. And I fully buy into the vision that is behind this. And I see a lot of enterprise applications having Ethereum as a service and so forth. And I know what Vitalik Buterin and Vlad Zamfir are doing in terms of Casper and trying to switch over to proof of stake. But
Sure.
how are we going to scale Ethereum on a personal level where people don't have to run an entire gigantic blockchain on their computer or trust it to a third party, which defeats the spirit of it?
Sure. Great question. So very quickly I'll go technical and I'll go personal. So right now, being in my poor man's analogy of 1994, where the internet started in 96, right now blockchains don't scale. There is a specific scalability improvement roadmap that involves transitioning from proof of work, the consensus algorithm that's currently being used, also being used in Bitcoin, to proof of stake. B, there is the evolution of sharding, where essentially shards of the blockchain have to form consensus instead of the entire blockchain. C, there is the evolution of what are called state channels. So it's essentially a state channel is if I took all 200 of us out to the bar and I gave the bartender my credit card and I bought us all a Shirley Temple and then all an appetizer, all a dessert, or an entree and all a dessert. Each one of those orders could essentially be batched into one large order, and the transaction to open the tab would start on-chain, and then you'd have those micro transactions, everyone's drink, appetizer, entree, dessert, and then basically when we close the tab, that would happen on-chain. So it's essentially the ability to batch. So all of those are in various times or not times, but places of maturity. And I think that they'll all basically start catching up to each other on-chain and off-chain over the next 2 years. Really kind of, I think, January 2020, it'll be pretty well functioning. Now, in terms of the human aspects of this, I think there are lots of layers to that onion. One is the notion of governance and understanding now that we're encumbering assets and moving assets in real time rather than moving communication, which is what the internet's previously been used for. And for those of you who may or may not have been following Ethereum in its infancy, there was a time called the DAO, where there was a decentralized autonomous organization that was essentially hacked. And there was essentially money stolen because of a bug in the code. And we're starting to see people come together to essentially define governance. And what we're starting to see is that, at least in the Ethereum ecosystem, governance is actually raising higher in the stack to the application layer. So I think that's one piece to consider. Secondly, in terms of scaling humans, I think very similar to how we started with dial-up and then we went to broadband, et cetera, and kind of optimized the initial internet. Right now, you do have to download a full client, but you're starting to see the evolution of light clients that will continue to permeate. And I think with pruned Patricia Merkle trees, you're also going to see the ability not to have to download the entire blockchain. So I think that those will be different steps. But I mean, the human aspect of this is probably the most important one.
What Merkle trees?
Pruned Patricia Merkle.
Pruned Merkle trees. I understand sharding, and I understand the state channels is important.
Yep.
Dimension to this, but I'm trying to wrap my head around, like, what's the roadmap to get and to incentivize people running small personal nodes that actually facilitate the decentralized vision of this?
There's
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So
then-
basically, what's the roadmap to incentivize people that are running nodes to be part of this network? So one piece of it is when you transition to proof of stake, you essentially start creating a behavioral economic incentive to deposit and propagate an interest rate to yourself. So basically, instead of using hardware mining that's rampant in China, people can stake basically like an electronic deposit, and they will start validating the networks.
Right, but that's going to create an oligopoly because people have to put up money to do that, and that's not creating a true decentralized network. Like, how does somebody say, I want to download this open source software for free, I want to run this as a peer on the network, and run things that are, like check a couple of boxes and say, this is relevant to my ecosystem.
So I think like through mesh networks where you can start using, the one part is that if you don't necessarily have a smartphone, that's going to probably be a bit of a difference maker because you're going to need kind of mobile to run at least a light client. So it's not a perfect science yet, but I think that it's evolving and it's better than what we've got now.
Okay, here we go.
All right.
No problem.
Andrew, thank you very much. It was wonderful. It's probably the best session that I've heard for a long time. I wanted to know your opinion about the permission blockchain.
Sure.
And what's going on today. The big companies like the IBM dealing with Hyperledger Fiber. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So funny enough, I helped create kind of the first permission blockchain, which was essentially putting a permission version of the Go implementation of Ethereum onto Azure about 4 years ago. And what I think the best analogy that I can use is intranets and the internet. Right now, we're in '94, and the next generation of the internet doesn't scale, doesn't have great privacy features. ZK snarks are early, ZK starks are early, which are all fields of cryptography. And enterprises, governments, people need a place to play. And create those proofs of concepts, create those sandboxes. And so I think that there's functionality there for permissioned blockchains to learn what the technology is while the public permissionless ones mature with scalability, with the incorporation of these types of cryptographic primitives. And we'll see a lot of that. Just working in a permissioned environment, you've got a walled garden, and basically it's a place to learn. Now, also in the intranets and internet analogy, where everyone was on intranets first because the internet was scary, and then we saw this whole world evolve onto the internet. But that said, there are still intranet use cases. Swift, which touches all of our money, which moves around all the world's money right now, never touched the internet. It's all on a private intranet. And so we'll start seeing use cases that may be very specific to permissioned blockchains evolve. But I think the majority of this is just in a transitionary period.
Thank you so much, Andrew. The question that comes to my mind, I can digest it, is when you mentioned the application like a peer-to-peer music distribution, like a musician just put his music on the blockchain, we eliminate iTunes, for example, Apple as a middleman. Somebody must develop that smart contract, that blockchain. Somebody must provide a place that I can go and search for this music and just find it as a consumer. Somebody must develop that. Somebody must provide the storage. They want to get paid. And if you add all those, because it's decentralized, the cost must be maybe even much higher than what Apple did as iTunes, because it's centralized. They have economy of scale. They can reduce the cost.
Right.
It's expensive right now today because they don't have competition. But as soon as they see, for example, there is a blockchain alternative, they can lower the price much lower than what would be possible on the blockchain.
So what I tried to say multiple times is this technology gives a price discovery mechanism for the value of intermediation. I'm not saying by any means all intermediaries are going to go away tomorrow. But I do think that in many cases, we're going to see the intermediation margin condensed. And that's what we've got the next rest of humanity to figure out. But I'd argue that what we're seeing now is the compression of those margins, even in these early POC, pre-1996 states. And in each vertical, it's different. There are very transparent industries. There are very opaque industries. My wife's a lawyer. I love lawyers. But that industry is marred with opacity. You know, you get charged a billable hour. It's all on arcane software. You don't see what you're getting charged your billable hour for in big law today. The notion of audit is arcane. The notion of double entry accounting was created in the 1600s by a monk. And if I give you $1, there's the debit on my side for the dollar, there's the credit on your side for the dollar. You can just change that to $1.50. That was Enron. I mean, literally, they were just changing entries in the database. Now, if I give you the dollar, let's just add the blockchain to the example. There's going to be the debit on my side, there's going to be the credit on your side, but then when I give you the dollar and we have the blockchain as the database, there's this immutable handshake, notarization, watermarking that I gave you the dollar. So you can't change that and I can't change that anymore. And what we just did was automated audit. KPMG, Ernst & Young, PwC, Deloitte, you know, how much money is paid just figuring out when did you send me the invoice and when did I pay you the dollar? We can start automating those.
Hi. So I have a curiosity and a concern. Could you speak a little to the opportunity of blockchain with healthcare, especially EMR and that sort of data, and then also in that same when it comes to things like data with blockchain, I've seen a couple of implementations. My concern is I can understand the value of the blockchain within a contained ecosystem, right?
Sure.
But then there's the existence and proliferation of alternate markets, the dark web, where that proof of record, that immutability is no longer verifiable or ascertain, right? Asserted. How does that work?
Okay, so first we'll do blockchain with healthcare, data, and then the dark web. Okay, all right. let me see how I can do it. So what I've started to see early use cases in healthcare have been around the automation in the U.S. on the automation of insurance claim reimbursement. In a prior life, I actually owned a revenue cycle management company, so basically a database company for healthcare, like an EMR, but with the insurance aspects of it. But basically, we're starting to see kind of if-then-else statements where if patient goes to Dr. Smith and he has this procedure and he has these diagnosis codes, then payment, else failure. So basically, if you can automate that, and kind of reduce the manual aspects of that. We've also seen aspects in developing economies where if they don't necessarily have the means for all of the types of identity services that we take for granted for in the US, they can basically use their footprint as a baby that starts their digital identity. and you can attach attributes to that footprint, which begins their essential identity and their record of vaccinations. So Philips Healthcare did one of those. With respect to data, it is a murky part, especially with GDPR that just came down the pike. There are aspects of this that I think, and this is another reason why we're in these permissioned sandboxes right now, because it's not a perfect science. I think it's going to be a clunky few years. But basically, with things like GDPR, we're starting to see fields of cryptography, like zero-knowledge proofs and ZK Starks, where you can encrypt various aspects of the data. And I don't know if I got your last question on the dark web, but if you look through history, the bad boys started using all the technology first. You know, the internet started with gambling, gaming, pornography, and buying drugs. It was a very similar trajectory.
There were bad things going on in the 16th
Yeah,
century
and
as
it's
well.
worse with cash.
I knew you'd get a lot of questions. We're going to run out of time here, so I'd urge everyone to go after them. Ask their questions in private. But I had a question. Everything you talked about has been what we call disruptive. And if you look at whether it's networking and evolution of the web, et cetera, but look 40 years back, look to today, still a status quo. Wall Street's still supreme. There's still, the markets are what we look at. Capital has maybe become even more centralized than it was. What you're talking about with everyone becoming a stakeholder who has a mutual interest to root for everybody is utterly disruptive. It sounds like really upsetting the status quo in a way that nothing has, certainly in our lifetimes. How do you encourage people to do that? Just watch what the developments are?
No, definitely not watch. Go and build. Go build businesses, build software, learn and participate. It's a ground up movement.
Andrew, thank you very much. Anyone has questions for him, catch him before he leaves the room. I knew this would be a great session with lots of questions. Thank you.